At 4 a.m., before the city wakes up, the richest man on the block is already working. Not in a glass tower. Not behind a Bloomberg terminal. He's standing over a steel cart. Boiling oil. Counting change with fingers permanently stained yellow from turmeric. And here's the uncomfortable part. The tiny food stall everyone ignores on the walk to work might be running a better business model than half the venture-backed startups burning millions of dollars a month. Because the street vendor understands something modern companies forgot. Cash flow first. Narrative later. In almost every major city on Earth, there's a version of this story unfolding right now. A vendor selling noodles in Bangkok. Tea in Mumbai. Tacos in Mexico City. Fruit by the roadside in Lagos. Tiny operations. No MBA. No investors. No disruption. And yet somehow, some of them quietly become empires. Not overnight. Not through genius branding. Through math. Very boring math. Take the story of a man selling shawarma from a cart outside a crowded train station. The first year, he makes barely enough to survive. But he notices something strange. At lunch, customers line up faster than he can serve them. People don't just want food. They want speed. So he cuts the menu in half. Fewer choices. Faster turnover. Now he serves twice as many people per hour. That sounds small. It isn't. Because once a street vendor figures out throughput, the entire business changes shape. Most people think businesses grow because profits go up. That's not quite true. Businesses grow because time gets compressed. One customer every 10 minutes is survival. One customer every 30 seconds is scale. And street vendors understand scale in the most brutal way possible. If the line stops moving, they stop eating. No quarterly cushion. No investor bailout. No corporate jargon about long-term vision. Just immediate feedback from reality. That pressure creates unusually disciplined businesses. Here's where things get interesting. A typical small food cart might operate on margins of 10 to 15% after expenses. Not amazing. But the inventory moves daily. Cash comes in immediately. No waiting 90 days for invoices. No subscription churn analysis. No accounts receivable nightmare. A customer hands over cash. Inventory disappears. Cycle complete. Again. And again. And again. Now compare that to a trendy startup. The startup spends money acquiring users who may or may not become profitable later. The vendor acquires customers because the food smells good from 30 feet away. One burns capital. The other compounds it. And eventually, the vendor notices another pattern. The real money isn't in one cart. It's in replication. This is where street economics quietly transforms into empire building. Because once the process becomes predictable, expansion stops looking risky. The recipe is standardized. The supplier relationships exist. The demand is proven. So the vendor opens a second cart. Then a third. But here's the hidden mechanism most people miss. The first cart wasn't just selling food. It was financing the next location. No venture capital. No bank loan. The customer funded expansion directly. Which sounds obvious. Until you realize this is exactly how some of the largest restaurant chains on earth originally scaled. Tiny daily transactions. Relentlessly repeated. McDonald's famously optimized burger assembly into industrial choreography. Street vendors do the same thing instinctively. Different scale. Same logic. And there's a strange irony here. Elite business culture loves complexity. Street businesses survive by removing it. A corporate consultant calls it operational optimization. A vendor calls it don't waste motion. Same idea. One costs $400 an hour. Then comes the phase that changes everything. Control of supply. At first, the vendor buys ingredients from wholesalers. But wholesalers take margin. So eventually, the vendor starts buying directly from farms. Then maybe opens a small kitchen. Then controls distribution. Now the business is no longer a cart. It's infrastructure. And infrastructure businesses behave differently. Margins widen. Competitors struggle to keep up. New vendors become dependent on the same supply chain. This is how tiny informal businesses slowly formalize into economic power. Not through a dramatic breakthrough. Through gradual control over friction. And this matters right now because the global economy is quietly moving back toward this model. People assume modern wealth comes from apps, algorithms, and financial engineering. But in uncertain economies, cash-efficient businesses suddenly become very attractive again. High interest rates punish companies addicted to borrowed money. Consumers become more price-sensitive. Investors stop tolerating endless losses disguised as growth. Suddenly the humble street vendor starts looking less primitive. And more anti-fragile. Especially when you realize how fragile many modern businesses actually are. A delivery startup can collapse if funding disappears for 6 months. A vendor who owns inventory, controls costs, and understands local demand can survive economic chaos surprisingly well. Not comfortably. But sustainably. There's another uncomfortable truth buried in this story. A lot of billion-dollar companies are essentially trying to recreate digitally what street vendors already mastered physically. Attention. Location. Convenience. Repeat behavior. The hot dog stand on the corner understood customer retention long before Silicon Valley invented the term. Of course, there's a limit to the romance here. Street economies are also brutally unstable. One illness. One police crackdown. One bad season. Everything can collapse. Informal businesses often survive without safety nets, legal protections, or reliable financing. Many never escape subsistence. For every vendor who builds an empire, thousands remain trapped in survival mode. That's the part business mythology usually edits out. Because the modern obsession with entrepreneurship tends to flatten all stories into inspiration. But this isn't really an inspirational story. It's a story about systems. About how tiny advantages compound. How cash flow quietly beats hype. How operational discipline often matters more than intelligence. And maybe most importantly, how the people closest to economic reality often understand money better than the people furthest from it. The vendor doesn't have the luxury of pretending numbers don't matter. Every wasted ingredient matters. Every slow customer matters. Every rainy day matters. And maybe that's why some of the most durable business empires in the world didn't begin in boardrooms. They began on sidewalks. With smoke in the air. Noise everywhere. And someone trying to sell one more meal before the crowd disappeared.